Every single fighter that we talk about today is great. Every one of them reached incredible heights. Some of them are the best to ever walk into the cage. And yet every single fighter we talk about in this video has had a career that could have been so much more. Greatness does not exclude fighters from having potential that they did not reach. And through circumstances outside of their incredible talents, everybody we talk about today left fans wondering what might have been had things been different. I'm Tommy from MMA On Point. A massive thank you to our channel Hall of Famers for their continued support, and these are 10 great MMA careers that frustratingly came up short. Number 10, Luke Rockhold. If you were watching the sport in 2013, then you know that nearly everybody thought that Luke Rockhold was going to be the guy. Coming into the UFC as the Strikeforce middleweight champion at 10-1 with 8 finishes, incredible striking, and elite ground game, people were thinking he could be the one to dethrone Anderson Silva. But he would unfortunately make his debut against the TRT-iest version of Vitor Belfort, who spammed spinning heel kicks like he was playing EA UFC until one connected and he absolutely smashed Rockhold's initial hype. But he quickly regained it, going on a run of 4 straight victories with 4 finishes, setting up a title bout with Chris Weidman. By this time, sentiment about Vitor's TRT run had changed considerably, and many gave Luke the benefit of the doubt about that loss.
No one in the fight game has that much respect for Vitor.
His incredible performance against Weidman, despite being on antibiotics due to an infection, to earn the gold had re-established Rockhold as the future all-time great everyone expected. Then he immediately lost that title to Michael Bisping in one of the biggest upsets ever, in large part because he arrogantly dismissed the short-notice opponent.
I'm never opposed to easy money. I'll take a paycheck and to shut Bisping's mouth for good.
A brutal loss to Yoel Romero for interim gold, and then a disastrous attempt to move up to 205 had Rockhold as the butt of jokes. His status as future GOAT long gone. Frustratingly for fans of Luke, all the pieces were there, but he was never able to put them together consistently, it seemed, and so his greatness would be squandered. Number 9, Henry Cejudo. When future Triple C entered the UFC at 27 years old with his Olympic gold medal pedigree, the general sentiment was, wow, if this guy can put the rest of it together, he's going to be special. And of course he did. Using that Olympic drive and determination, Cejudo quickly became a high-level fighter and earned his first title challenge after just 4 bouts in the promotion. Although he'd come up short, by 31 he'd beat the unbeatable Demetrius Johnson, and then went on to double champ status with defenses in both divisions. This guy beats DJ, TJ Dillashaw, Dominic Cruz, has 2 belts and is in his prime, then decides he's not going to fight for 3 years.
The oddest retirement in MMA history.
The choice was an attempt to leverage for money, and I can't blame the dude for that, but as a fan, what an absolute waste. 3 prime years for someone who was on their way to GOAT status, just completely lost. After he returned, he dropped a split decision for the bantamweight title, then got beat by Merab Dvalishvili. Now he's 37, and the likelihood of him reaching the heights of his career again are slim. What a disappointing thing to decide to do right at your peak. Number 8, Nick Diaz. You ready to have your mind blown? Nick Diaz returned to the UFC after his run as Strikeforce champion at 28 years old. He has just had 4 fights in the 13 years since he beat down BJ Penn. All losses. If you watched my video about the age of decline in mixed martial arts, Nick Diaz re-entered the UFC in 2011 in his prime and was given an immediate title shot. Of course, after missing a press obligation, Nick would be forced to fight Penn instead of champion GSP, a bout that would elude him for nearly 2 years, first due to an injury from St. Pierre that forced an interim title fight with Carlos Condit that he lost, although it was close, then a year-long suspension due to a failed test for marijuana following the bout. After he finally got the big payday in a losing effort against George for the title, he sat for a year until a new UFC deal was reached, and then he was given a fight with Anderson Silva. This bizarre bout would see both men fail post-fight tests, Silva for PEDs, and Diaz again for pot, this time a 3rd strike that saw him get an initial career-killing 5-year suspension, eventually reduced to 18 months.
They're not gonna let me fight, so I would go teach jiu-jitsu.
They're going to take away Nick Diaz's career from a harmless, at worst, harmless, dried plant. Really?
Disillusioned with the sport and able to live off his winnings, Diaz drifted away from fighting and ran into difficulties outside the cage, finally ending his long hiatus after nearly 7 years in a return bout against Robbie Lawler that he didn't even seem like he wanted to do. Given that GSP would step away from the sport just months after defeating Diaz, without the suspensions and Nick being Nick, who knows what kind of prime run he could have had in the UFC. Number 7, Cain Velasquez. When you look at what Cain Velasquez brought to the table in terms of his skill set and athleticism, there's no doubt in my mind that under the right circumstances, he could have been the greatest heavyweight fighter of all time.
I think he's the best in terms of like physical ability.
Stipe is the most accomplished heavyweight of all time, but the greatest heavyweight of all time is Cain Velasquez.
He could have had the opportunity to solidify that status and leave, no doubt, had his career gone differently. But unfortunately, following his second successful title defense, when he ended his trilogy with Junior Dos Santos, his body nosedived. First, after a long wait to fight due to filming Tough, Velasquez was forced out of his bout with Fabricio Verdum due to a knee injury. And then, of course, he returned and made the mistake of not acclimating to the altitude in Mexico City, resulting in the loss of his title. While a rematch was scheduled twice, it would never materialize. First, when Cain was forced out because he had injured his back, and then after defeating Travis Brown at UFC 200 because the commission wouldn't allow him to compete with bone spurs in his back. He'd return 2.5 years later only to lose to Francis Ngannou in 26 seconds and then subsequently retire from competition, as his body was simply never going to be the same.
It's just really frustrating, because I know I'm capable of much more.
All in all, the last part of his career, a whole 6 years, we got a compromised version of Velasquez that never really could have sealed his legacy as the greatest heavyweight ever.
This is getting sad.
Number 6, Dominick Cruz. Now, you see a guy like Dominick Cruz in a video about careers that fell short, and you might think, Cruz is arguably the greatest bantamweight of all time. 2 title defenses in the WEC, another 3 in the UFC. He beat Demetrius Johnson. He won the title a second time after a massive layoff against TJ Dillashaw. In what world did Dom Cruz's career not reach its potential? Well, there is of course those huge gaps of time due to injury. 4 years following his defense against DJ, and then a year and a half after he finally returned from that injury, returning again to get a second shot at the gold when he beat Dillashaw. Those are huge gaps in the prime of this man's career.
Hurt my knee, ACL, MCL. I get through my second ACL reconstruction. I tore the quad muscle off the bone, so it separated from the bone.
Imagine a scenario where following the Johnson defense, Cruz fights and continues to win for 4 years. If that had happened, his victory over DJ would have aged incredibly given the run that he would have at flyweight, and such a reign would have likely seen Cruz reach #1 pound-for-pound status. Not only that, he would have potentially ended up in all-time GOAT discussions. Yes, Cruz's career was incredible, despite his struggles with injuries and years of his prime being taken from him, but what could have been is the type of legacy that maybe 1 or 2 fighters has ever had, period. Number 5, Jon Jones. The same argument I applied to Dominick Cruz applies even more so to Jon Jones. Because while it might seem like an insane take to say the arguable greatest fighter of all time had a career that fell short, there's really no other way to look at it. Jon was already an all-time great by the time his first ever suspension and subsequent title stripping happened in early 2015. That was nearly 10 years ago. If you add up each suspension, as well as the time he took after his contract dispute and vacating of the light heavyweight title, and his current hiatus due to injury, Jon's had about 2,850 days he's been unavailable to fight. That is 7.8 years. During a decade span of time, of course never beaten in the cage, and before the suspension averaging 3 fights a year, if Jones never gets suspended, never has his contract disputes, never gets injured, we wouldn't even be talking about if you could argue that he's not the GOAT, because he'd have every single record that exists by now. There would be no argument. Now, I'm not saying there couldn't be a late career decline, but there is no doubt that a ton of Jon Jones's greatness was left on the table over the last 10 years, and the sport is worse off as a result. The current frustrations over his lack of interest in unifying the titles against Aspinall pales in comparison to the greatness that he's squandered despite being the best ever. Number 4, Tony Ferguson. Many of the fighters on this list are cursed, but Tony might be the most so.
Don't you put that evil on me, Ricky Bobby!
And that is because he is the only fighter in this video who was never afforded a title opportunity in the UFC, despite for a time him being arguably the best lightweight in the world. And that is because of some of the worst luck in the history of this sport. For starters, Tony was in the UFC title picture at the same time that Conor McGregor was holding that belt hostage.
You're gonna need a fucking army to come take them belts off me.
So even when he won interim gold a whole year into McGregor's reign, he never had the opportunity to capitalize on it. After Conor was stripped, it then became his failed bouts with Khabib Nurmagomedov. While the fight would fall through on 5 separate occasions, 2 of them were meant to be for undisputed gold. The first of which fell apart when Tony injured his knee after tripping over a cable on fight week, and the second when Khabib was unable to travel due to the sudden COVID lockdowns. Would Tony have ended up a champion? There is no way of ever knowing, and that is the part about his career that is so frustrating. His struggles as of late have only added to that bitter feeling fans have about what more there should have been for El Cucuy. Number 3, Conor McGregor. On several different occasions, Conor McGregor has addressed fans who have said they wish 2016 Conor was still around, and inevitably McGregor will claim that in his current iteration, he's way better. But that was nearly a decade ago, and if the current version of Conor is better than he was at the peak of his stardom, he's not shown it to us at all. With just 4 fights in the 8 years since he hoisted those 2 titles into the air at Madison Square Garden, titles he would never defend, Conor has lost 3 times. His only victory over Donald Cerrone in what was essentially a warm-up fight, but one that frustratingly led to nothing, as we would not see him in action again for a whole year. It's not just the losses though, but the complete lack of activity.
My comeback is scheduled for the end of the year.
This by the end
Not
of
this year. He won't fight this year.
When he hit his peak in 2016, who could blame the guy for fighting Floyd, for focusing on other ventures outside the cage, for getting lost in the lifestyle of the rich and the famous? And yes, a major injury was also a factor in all of this. But given how much time has passed since UFC 205, it is very hard not to be frustrated by what could have been, given how massive the expectations were at the heights of his stardom. Number 2, Khabib Nurmagomedov. It's kind of crazy how distant a memory Khabib's title reign seems now. In part, I think because COVID felt like a decade in and of itself, but also because the sport moves on so rapidly at the very top. Right now, as I write these words, Khabib is 35 years old. On the date of his final lightweight title defense, he'd just turned 32. We're talking about a fighter that up to that point had lost a single round in his career. His 3 defenses, all finishes. A perfect 29-0. Now, it's true that injuries had plagued Khabib his entire career, and as such, he wasn't as active as he would have liked to be. But even if you had a single defense every year since he retired, that still easily makes him the greatest lightweight of all time, and it wouldn't even be close. His retirement, given the tragic circumstances of his father's passing due to COVID, and everything that meant to his career, was of course entirely understandable. Some things are more important than our ambitions. But as a fan, when somebody who is that great retires in their prime at the very top of the sport, when it looked like nobody would ever be able to stop them, it's hard not to think about what might have been if things were different. Number 1, Brock Lesnar. Not sure any fighter has ever done more in less time than Brock Lesnar. Now yes, he came into the UFC with built-in star power, but there is no denying that prior to Ronda and Conor, Lesnar was easily the biggest draw the sport had ever seen. And to win the title in just his 3rd UFC bout, after only a little more than a year in the sport period, is pretty goddamn incredible. And it is really unfortunate that his health would completely destroy his MMA career. It started when he was still champion. His struggles with diverticulitis would delay his bout with Shane Carwin for a whole year. After that amazing victory, we wouldn't see Brock in the octagon for 15 months, as he would have continued issues related to his stomach.
I had 104 temperature and felt like I was shot in the guts, and I had a rupture of one of my diverticuli, which means I had a hole in my stomach.
The eventual bout with Cain Velasquez would see Lesnar lose the title and then 6 months later require major surgery.
I had 12 inches of my colon removed, and so I don't even know how many months that has gone by, and here I am.
He was simply not the same Lesnar in the return bout against Alistair Overeem, and retired as training had become too difficult due to his ailments. A return to the WWE further solidified his decision to step away from the sport, but for his 200 appearance. Brock was still very green by the time he retired, and given how successful he was, with such little experience on top of not being in good health, I cannot imagine how amazing his career might have been if circumstances were different. Not to mention, had he entered the UFC immediately after his collegiate wrestling career instead of the WWE. Could Lesnar have been the greatest heavyweight ever? Unfortunately, we will never know, and that is what makes his short career so frustrating. But you know who's frustratingly great at what they do all the time? The editor of this video, Max Randall. Dude always bangs out incredible edits. Please follow him on all his socials, and go check out his awesome YouTube channel. A big ol' shout to our channel Hall of Famers. Truly could not do it without you. You guys are the best. Thank you for your support. If you'd like to be a channel member too, hit the join button. There is exclusive content. We live stream our writers meetings, and we love getting your feedback and suggestions in the chat. Like and subscribe because we're always pumping out bangers here. Leave a comment about which of these careers was the most frustrating for you as a fan, and thank you so much for watching, you guys. Catch you on the flip side.